All right, welcome to the Politics of Money, the official podcast of the IFSD. So I'm here with Kevin Page, Canada's first Parliamentary Budget Officer and CEO of IFSD.
Good to be with you.
Thanks as always. Thanks for traveling so far, because your office is right next door to this boardroom, so it's a good try. A lot of talk this time of year, Kevin. We have main estimates coming out, departments put out their spending plans, and we get into this situation every single year that people are worried about. What do we compare this to? We just had a budget in November, arguably a good thing to have a budget ahead of main estimates, but the numbers don't line up. And I think there's a lot of confusion as to why they don't line up. And I thought maybe we could take a few minutes to talk about how our system works. And even if something says it is a government spending plan, it might not be the spending plan you're thinking of, and why sometimes it's like comparing apples and oranges.
Okay. You're right. We get to this moment every year, and it seems like this year it seems more somewhat consequential because there's a lot of spending in budget 2025, and the people are interested in the reallocation part. Like, how are we going to the spending cuts? Government said they could find 30 billion or so over the next 5 years, and they could reallocate this to other spending, particularly national defense. So everybody's combing through these departmental spending documents, and they're getting confused. We have these parallel systems. We have a budget system, which people are familiar with. And we saw budget 2025, and there's accounting principles behind that budget. Parliament approves the strategy. It's a big media moment. There's lockups, and there's like all kinds of media coverage on this system. And I think it's the system that people are most familiar with. Yeah. And then we have this other parallel system, right, which is, some people refer to it as the estimates, main estimates, supplementary estimates, and it's a system that runs alongside the budget, that also leads to departmental spending plans and performance reports, done on a different accounting system, done on a certain section of spending. And, it's critical. Really, it's really critical to our system, but it's really hard to do the crosswalk between the estimate system and the budget system. And, what we found, particularly last week with the release of departmental spending plans, is, people were looking at reference levels. People are confused. They can't do the crosswalk.
And it's interesting that, so we worked on the estimates process at Treasury Board. We worked on budgets, which is the fiscal plan. And then we were in Parliament helping parliamentarians decipher all of those plus the estimates. And it was hard. And in some ways, we have a training program where we help public servants kind of trace a budget measure from the budget document through estimates to public accounts. And Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, more often than not, we can't see it.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And maybe we could talk about that. Every one of these involves maybe a different type of decision, right? Like, we talk about the budget, which really means that the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have okayed a fiscal plan and Cabinet's blessed it. And so it really represents a really critical decision gate that's political in nature, right? And the words give you all kinds of political guidance as to what their priorities are, but it's a plan. And I think it's not, no one can spend money on a plan, right? And so what happens next, Kevin? Why can't a department just read something in the budget and go spend it?
Yeah. So just on the budget, and before we start talking about like the departments, on the budget itself, it is the critical financial document of the government. It is a plan. 5-year plan tends to be 5-year plan. I mean, definitely the media, citizens, Parliament are very focused on it. The bond rating agencies are very focused on it. They do fiscal analysis based on these spending plans. And then there's this other parallel system, which is departments don't get to spend money unless they get the approvals from Parliament to spend the money. And so this system of the estimates, right, department by department, a different accounting system. For every department, like obviously a lot of focus on D&D. What is their operational budget? There's a vote for operations. What is their capital budget? There's a vote for on a cash basis for the capital budget. What are they transfers, grants, and contributions? And so it's this parallel system is a system that Parliament they approve these voted appropriations. So again, there's a difference between statutes and voted appropriations. Statutes, old age security, the Canada Health Transfer, they're approved by legislation that's separate. There's the statutory authorities, but these voted appropriations, which is a big chunk of overall spending, more than $200 billion or $550 billion every year is voted appropriations. It's the process that we work through Parliament to approve these actual authorities.
And it's not just one bill, right? So there'll be main estimates. And in this system, we're hoping that a large number of those budget measures make it in, but they don't necessarily make it in because there's one step they have to do before they get there. They all have to go through Treasury Board. So they got to get their internal spending authorities to make sure that the program structures, performance framers, source of funds are all confirmed before we even breathe life into that budget. Departments, when they're putting out their departmental spending plan, that's the stuff for which they have authority. So they put a 3-year reference level forecast, for example, but they're only writing down in that what they already have authorities for. So say, Kevin, a program sunset last year, and it's on track to get renewed or put together with another program or cut. If that wasn't done prior to main estimates being tabled, it's not going to show up, right?
Yeah, that's a really good way of explaining the confusion around this crosswalk between the estimate system and the budget. Like typically, with a voted appropriation, a lot of these programs, it's almost by default that we'll give you a 5-year, period of time to run a certain program. Could be a training program as an example. They'll get a 5-year authority from cabinet. So the department knows that they have 5 years, to manage a certain, say, a training program. But they don't have, until they go back to Treasury Board, they won't get, they don't have assurances that the executive will approve that authority beyond the 5 years. But, from a budget perspective, the people at Department of Finance where I work, we'll just assume that they'll get that, that extension will exist, right? That will continue on that training program. But from a department, a person in department could be the human resources department, could be a training program. That 5 years, that ends for them. They don't have the authority from Treasury, so they won't put it in the departmental plan. So yeah, right. It's an example of an area where we'll see departmental authorities really drop off in these plans because the department doesn't have the executive authority, to kind of assume that, that sunsetter will continue. Again, Parliament, what they're looking at is this, they're going to get this annual voted appropriation. The departmental spending plans are there to create the context. But the annual appropriations on these voted appropriations, it's a 1 year. So again, and the department can't spend unless they have that annual voted appropriation.
And we also have kind of almost the opposite problem too. Like we have a client of ours called and said, hey, the program that they're really focused on wasn't in the budget. And our point was, our budget is typically, it's made up of 2 parts, the incremental new measures, and the fiscal plan includes all the stuff that was previously approved by cabinet all the way back to Confederation. And so when we look at the main estimates, that's not just an incremental spending, that's all the spending that's rolling over. And sometimes for our students, we talk about, we're at the University of Ottawa, the Rideau Canal, we can see that outside our window. And we say, that's been appropriated since before Confederation. It rolls over. You're not going to see it in the federal budget to said X allocation for the Rideau Canal unless it's new money. They're a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They got to fix it up because the UN says you have to keep it at a certain level. That might show up in a budget, but the money that's rolling over year, that's going to show up in the estimates. And so if you're looking in the wrong document for something, it's possible that you'll miss it. You'll miss it and it could be there, or you'll see it and it's really, subject to other decisions that have not yet been taken. So Kevin, how do we know where all these systems kind of come together? Like, how do you get a picture? Canadians, you're a taxpayer, you're the bond rating agencies. How do you know where Canada at the end of the day sits when you've got a cash-based appropriation system and an accrual accounting-based fiscal system, and we're trying to figure out, all right, so what was the deficit? Where do we go for this?
Well, it does come together in something called the public accounts. And you see the systems kind of coming together in terms of the volume 1 provides a sort of big picture, accounting universes, overall spending, links it back to the budget. In volumes 2, 3, and 4, you're getting breakdowns by department. And so even when you go to the departmental breakdown, you can start to see, how, we move to a common accounting system. And you can see the links between, on an operating or capital, a transfer kind of basis. You see the adjustments for the accrual. So it comes together, but it comes together very late in the game, right? Which is very confusing right now because, we have Parliament and media kind of combing through departmental plans and saying, I'm confused as hell.
So, Kevin, one of the things I remember when we were leaving for the Parliamentary Budget Office, we had a nice coffee. The Deputy Minister of Finance threw for us and kind of was teasing us that we were going from a place at the Privy Council office that arguably had the most information in government to Parliament that had some of the least information in government. And I think what you're referring to is that the view that Parliament gets and that Canadian gets very often is from these estimate documents. So we talked about that they're in a different accounting language. Why do we have our budget done in accrual accounting, which recognizes you capitalize expenses. If you buy a tank and you think it's going to last 15 years, you record 1/15 of that every year. That's an example of how we treat capital under accrual. But if you pay cash for the tank, estimates will record that cash amount. And so this means that, the financial reporting is a little bit different between an accrual system and a cash-based appropriation system. But then we get back to public accounts, which goes back to an accrual system and presents it in kind of two ways, the chart of accounts and a program activity approach. Maybe talk about why that is and why we have those two views now in public accounts.
In terms of accounting standards, it is a standard for budgets to be presented on accrual basis. We want to see real capital budgeting. I remember when you joined the government 20 plus years ago, and one of the things you really did was really push capital budgeting across different departments and use that kind of approach. I remember when you costed fighter planes, how you were educating people that, around life cycles and around, depreciation. You costed a war. I remember you talked about depreciation in a theater of war. So these concepts of how to manage finances in an appropriate way, we really play out, across departments on very specific issues. They're very important, but we maintain both systems all the time,
right?
Accrual and cash, because ultimately when we're putting together a borrowing plan and we're going to Canadians or foreigners and say, okay, we want you to buy our treasury bills or government bonds, that, you need to know what the financial requirements of the government, you need a cash balance. It's more of a mystery why the estimate systems, devoted appropriations, operating capital transfers, where, we pretty much, we stick to this sort of cash basis. I think we don't have to stick to a cash basis. We could think of reforms in the future that, again, maintain both systems, but actually start to bring more alignment between what we call the estimate system, the system we use to get approvals from Parliament, with, the planning system, as you alluded to, the budget. So, but, we could make these adjustments on the estimate side. We've chosen not to. We're going to see defense budgets now really rise dramatically. The cash is going to become very important. Because enormous borrowing requirements are going to be developed in the short term because of military procurement, amongst other things, and it's good for Parliament to be mindful of the cash. But yeah, we're running these we're running parallel systems. But as you say, the public accounts, the accrual, the cash system kind of comes together. We get the presentation of budgetary and, surpluses or deficits on accrual basis. We get, the same in terms of, the accumulation of deficits, the size of the debt.
So I would argue that, it's natural if people maybe mix apples and oranges. I think the only reason we have a system maybe that's this complicated is that's provided employment for you and me for the last 20 years, right? That's, if it was straightforward.
And probably for the next 20 years, because there seems to be no impetus to reform the system.
So let's talk about that. The Prime Minister shifted the budget to November, and I know we did an open letter to whoever is going to win the next election that, please maybe make this stuff a little more straightforward, because other countries don't have separate, incremental budgets and appropriations. They kind of present, like companies do, the budget, right? Yeah. Base and increment together, all goes to the legislature to get approved together. And moving it to November means, they have a chance to get through Treasury Board and get more things in main estimates and make main estimates way more meaningful. It's a really positive step. But maybe we could talk about, so what would a government do now to maybe go a step further? And regardless of who's prime minister and which party's in power, if you care about Parliament being empowered to hold governments accountable, if you want citizens to understand how money's being spent, what are ways we can do to maybe simplify this so that you don't need a secret decoder ring to kind of go from budget to estimates to public accounts? Because I think that's where we're at right now.
Well, I recall that when you and I and our colleagues, Mustafa Asker here at IFSD, we went in front of the Operations and Estimates Committee I think it was chaired at that time by Pat Martin with the NDP. The NDP were the official opposition, and we said the system is broken. People are so confused, and they can't do these crosswalks. And I think that, so the pressure seems to build every, 5 or 10 years. I think we're actually in another moment right now where, like we saw, as you've alluded to, the prime minister saying, I'm moving the timing of the budget. I'm changing the financial cycle. I think we got, to have full budget is a really good idea. I think it's time now where we can bring this appropriation system, the supply of authority system, merge it almost with the budget system. So when people see departmental plans, D&D or veterans or agriculture or fisheries and oceans, they could eventually, like we could see nicely align up. So the departmental plans, 3 or 5 years, should probably be 5 years. It all rolls up. So we can, the budget and these departmental planning systems would actually be the very same. It's got to be hard for people in the House of Commons when they're voting on an operating vote for a department or a capital vote or a transfer vote. Like they need to understand, like, how does this link directly to the plan? Because they want to hold the government accountable to the plan. So I think there's pressure on the government, particularly now when they're talking about massive reallocation, to going towards, Department of National Defense, going towards capital investment, and trying to get to something called an operating balance in 3 years. Let's actually, over the next number of months, put together, departmental spending plans that are actually consistent with the budget. Put the pressure on the government now. And I think the first step was there, fall budget. And I think now the pressure is, there's an opportunity to create departmental plans that are consistent with the budget. We've seen that happen in some past budgets with pressure from parliamentarians. I want to see just spending plans by department that are consistent, but we didn't get that in the last budget.
And so maybe I'll pick up on one point that gave rise to some of the issues that we saw in the media, which is there were cuts announced, right? Like this is it was a significant reallocation budget, the likes of which we really haven't seen in our careers. We've seen fiscally driven cuts, but we've seen things were maybe more motivated by priorities, but rarely have we seen this kind of reallocation. So you can sense that why the system might look at this and see a department being reduced and react, right? And if a document says the government spending plan, like in a way, what else would you believe? But I want to talk about the fact that we were on a spending track that one could argue was starting to drift towards the less sustainable level under the kind of the Trudeau government. And with the kind of the hinge moment, the need to kind of defend Canada's sovereignty, to spend on defense, a reallocation was necessary, right? And so I think while there's a natural reflex to think about, well, there are cuts, there also need to be cuts. And so maybe we could talk about, Kevin, you've been at this since, before program review and been involved in designing, implementing, overseeing these reviews since the late 80s. Let's talk about the necessity. Why do we need an operating budget balance? And what does that mean for the way the government operates and the way it spends money?
Yeah, so we are running in budget 2025. The government basically said that they were prepared to run deficits that were relatively high relative to kind of in normal circumstances, in the 2 to 2.5% range, size of GDP, over the next number of years. But over the next 3 years, they said like this. We get to 3 years out, if we get consistent with a certain planning environment, they did not want to be deficit financing operational type spending that will be consumed in a given year, spending like transfers to persons or other transfers to governments. They wanted basically only to be deficit financing capital. So that's their fiscal target, their fiscal rule, which is fine. And we've seen that other countries have employed these sorts of fiscal targets and fiscal rules. And I think in the context of this hinge moment that you referred to, this pressure to get to a NATO target of 3.5 to 5 percentage points of GDP, depending on your measurement, the need to kind of diversify trade in a very different way because of a eruption of relationship with the United States. Also, the need to actually make sure that Canada is taking advantage of these potential opportunities with these new technologies, AI, biotechnology, clean tech, et cetera. So the public sector is still, it needs to be constrained. We're a AAA country, as you say, we're sustainable. But the spending, the level of debt relative to GDP is at a higher level, but still sustainable. So I think there is the pressure on the government to do this sort of reallocation, right? So that it's not always, we're going to, move to a more balanced framework in a 3-year time, operating balance in 3-year time, deficits, but only for capital investment as defined in the budget. So I think my sense is the markets they're comfortable with that. Like general OECD, IMF were relatively positive on the fiscal plan. But there's going to be real pressure in terms of a very slow economy to actually constrain spending in a certain way. There needs to be focus on spending restraint. So it's not a good thing when you have departmental plans that are creating just confusion. We got to get to a better place. And the pressure's got to be for this government to release departmental spending plans that are consistent with the budget so we can monitor these spending reductions. And you're right, we need to have restraint. And the restraint's going to go beyond just reductions in the size of the civil service. There's going to have to be restraint on a lot of these voted appropriations.
It would have been a good practice to start to see the plan for reductions by the time you get to main estimates, right? Like you do want to have Parliament in on where the cuts are happening, right? Like that is if Parliament's going to hold a government account, it's not just on what it spends, but also the choices it makes on where not to spend.
Yeah, and we want media to be able to understand these documents and not be confused. We want members of Parliament, so when they're actually they're voting on appropriations, it could be on, again, whether it's operating or capital or some transfer. They need to know what's actually in it, and to hold the government to account, they need to know how it relates to the overall planning framework. So we're not in a good place right now. The system is still broken. We keep kicking the can down the road. We've tried these different reviews. I think the Prime Minister made the move to get the budget in a better place in terms of the financial cycle. Now let's put pressure on, the Treasury Department or Treasury Board Secretary, the Finance Department, and the line departments to actually marry those two systems: voted appropriations to get authorities to, by Parliament to move forward, and the sort of broader planning system. And you're right, you and I have done work in different parts of the world, including Jamaica. When they present a budget, it's an integrated budget. You could add and subtract, you can add it up from a departmental perspective, or you can, kind of look at the top-down perspective we get in our budget, the transfers to persons, other levels of government, et cetera. But the planning and the appropriation system, it looks like it's one integrated piece. Ours is not integrated.
When we have this kind of rupture and global order trying to break down, the money, we talk about the money of politics, being able to explain the money gets to be really important because we need to build confidence in the legislature with Canadians. It's tough when the documents don't tell you what you need them to say. And so, you'll get reporting that might start to look a little offside with how things actually operate. But by the same token, we probably need more dialogue. We need better dialogue when we're dealing with a crisis that's now persisting. And I think at the election, there was a sense that, well, maybe the rupture with the U.S. was temporary. We get back to it, but it's not. And I think when we were evaluating platforms, we took some criticism because we thought this was now going to be a longer term feature. And I think we are now going to have to get the public service to start thinking about, so how do we organize to have better dialogue with Parliament? Because we're now making more fundamental, bigger decisions. We had a 10-year span where there was money and a lot of transfers and wealth transfer in particular, and spending after a 30-year period where we had 12 to 30% of GDP in spending, we jumped around 16. And we were still sustainable, but all of that pre-rupture, pre-hinge moment.
Yeah.
And so as we make this shift, the country has to make the shift. And I don't know if our systems have caught up, right?
They have not caught up. Yeah, the systems have not caught up. And you're right, for those big tectonic plates that you talked about that are shifting right now, we need to bring these systems together so that, the Parliament, media, and Canadians, they know basically how finances are being managed. I think what we saw, Sahir, last week was, a moment of confusion around, media kind of moving out and saying, taking these departmental plans and trying to link two very different accounting systems, a system built on appropriations and a planning budget system. And that is not a good thing. That will lead to an erosion of trust. I think the time has come that we need to address this issue of our financial system because they don't understand it. They can't do the crosswalk between these appropriation systems and the budget. We need to integrate these two systems and address this kind of trust deficit.
So we can accept that there's confusion, but we shouldn't accept that we can't do better.
When you have this much uncertainty or confusion around these different systems, And in the context of that rupture or hinge moment you talk about, it's a bad dynamic. So yeah, we need to get to a better place, and we can. You and I worked in these central agencies. We've been in front of committees, the Pat Martin Committee of Operations and Estimates, probably 15 years ago, talking about how to redesign the system to totally integrate them with consistent accounting, different ways to vote, right? Not on operating capital transfer vote, but actually voting on big programs that people can really understand. So if we need common sense, and we need to reduce the amount of uncertainty.
It's interesting that, the move that the Prime Minister made to move the budget to November, there are plenty of people who say, oh, that couldn't be done.
Yeah.
But you know what? Once the Prime Minister says it can be done, it will be done.
Okay. So if the Prime Minister says now that come the fall, I don't think they could do it for the spring update, but come the fall or budget 2026, they're going to present an integrated planning picture. I think he could do it. And I think the message, from him, that would be powerful. I'm sure the bureaucrats can get behind it. And Parliament would get behind it too.
Right. And we'll be less employable because the system will no longer require the secret decoder rings that we've acquired over 20 years.
But we'll find other things to do.
We will, definitely. I think landscaping, as Kevin has always suggested.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. This is a complicated topic. I don't think we simplified it, but hopefully we explained why there's this confusion. It happens regularly. And it's about a system and processes that are complex, and like appropriations, they're ancient. This is all the way back to Runnymede and Magna Carta, and they're processes where the Commons has to give authority to the government, to the king, to spend money. That's in the Constitution. The budget's not in the Constitution.
Yeah.
So these are serious processes that require serious attention.
Boy, can we fix it? If, for somebody, a prime minister, a finance minister, a president of a treasury board to say, we are going to fix this stuff, that would be such a positive legacy going forward for future parliaments and Canadians. And we need it now.
There you have it. It's doable. Let's hope that...
Make it happen.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.